This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Corenna and Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Now joining us in studio is Mark LaVerdiere, attorney and business owner at Apex Business Law. Thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to join you guys today.
Yes, we appreciate it.
So you just launched your own law firm, Apex Business Law. What led you to start this firm, and how does that reflect where your legal and business practice is headed?
I've been a partner at Rudman and Winchell for quite a few years now. Prior to that, I practiced at Griffin and Jordan over in Orono. And I've just wanted for years to set up my own practice and operate things the way that I want to operate them. Essentially, Apex Business Law is designed so that I can focus on what I've become really good at over the years. And you can glean that from the name. I didn't want to just set up a law firm that was LaVerdiere Law or something like that. I do business law. So I wanted to make that clear that it's a business practice. And really what I'm trying to do for my clients is almost serve a fractional in-house counsel. So the concept is a lot of people need specific services, but they can't necessarily afford to hire a full-time attorney to work for their company. So I think I can provide a good value add for people. And for me, it allows me to cut back on my client list. Going from having hundreds of clients to 30 clients or so, I'm able to service them in a more efficient manner, and I get a better quality of life by doing that. At the end of the day, that was kind of the concept. And what I'm going to be focusing on is, just as I said, I'm going to have a core group of clients. And then I'll also do some piecemeal work when it comes to business sales and purchases. So if people are buying or selling a company, I'll certainly do transactions like that. And I'll help out with some bank work like I've always done. But that's kind of the concept.
So when you're talking about business, what businesses are you working on?
I've historically helped people buy and sell companies. So I've done a lot of veterinary practice sales, for example, and I've done a lot of hotels. I've done pretty much every business, auto dealerships, everything as far as transferring the assets and making sure whether it's a stock sale or an asset sale. That's really my specialty. And then I also help people form companies, set up LLCs, and I just try to do a lot of strategic planning with people. Most people, I find, don't really know exactly what structure they should use when they're starting an enterprise. A lot of landlords buy real estate and they don't know exactly how to structure that. So what I try to do is help them set the company up and then give them some instructions about how to operate the company in a way that's going to preserve their liability protections. So those types of things are usually smaller transactions. The larger ones, when we're doing a multi-million-dollar business sale or something like that, or if I'm doing an out-of-state sale, I bring in a local counsel from that state.
So how many staff members do you have?
Right now, we've got 3, so I've hired a chief operating officer to help me administer the company, and then I've got a legal assistant and another general assistant.
And you're also a real estate investor, is that right? You have a side business?
Yes. My wife, Nazarene, and I both were independently in real estate before we met. Since we met, we've been acquiring more real estate, and we have our own property management company. And we also own a couple of hotels that we operate, generally seasonal hotels that are summer operations. And candidly, got into that because Nazarene likes Old Orchard Beach a lot. So we go down there for the summer and we run those hotels for the summer. But in the winter, we end up putting them as long-term rentals. So it's more in line with our typical business approach. Apart from that, we run the companies, and we do that in addition to practicing law. And for Nazarene, she works at the bank.
So do you have units throughout Maine, or are they focused in certain areas of Maine?
We have them throughout Maine. So we have some units in southern Maine. A lot of our portfolio is in the Old Orchard Beach area. And then in addition to that, we have units in Ellsworth, Bangor. My first portfolio that I purchased was in Old Town. So we're spread around a little bit throughout the state, and we're working on consolidating probably into fewer areas. But we're throughout the state, so we get to see a little bit of everything that's happening out there.
Well, the reason I ask is because if you're in the Portland market and then the Bangor market, there's a different focus on rent registry and rent control. So I didn't know if that affected you personally.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're very cognizant of the regulation that's out there, and we look at that very closely when we're purchasing properties. So I can tell you we've never purchased anything in Portland, for example, because of the regulation. And I think that that's true for a lot of investors. I think any intelligent investor is going to look at the market and see what the limitations are on your ability to make money. And you're not going to buy in markets that are difficult to work in. So For us, we've just targeted towns around Portland that are easier to work with. And the same is true for northern Maine. We do have units in Bangor, but Bangor is starting to talk about things that are very concerning from an investment standpoint. So we've made a decision at the moment to put a moratorium on our purchases in Bangor itself. We're still looking at towns around Bangor, but depending on how things go in the city with some of the stuff that they're doing, that will dictate whether we continue to invest our dollars in Bangor.
So speaking of Bangor, what are some of your concerns?
Well, the primary concerns for us are overregulation of the housing market. So the fundamental issue, as I see it, is that most landlords are smaller operators who use real estate as essentially a retirement plan. A lot of people have 401ks. A lot of people have duplexes. And the issue is that there seems to be a disconnect between the city council that's in place right now and the realities on the ground for real estate operators. And when I start hearing things about rent controls, for example, which has been brought up several times, and when I hear about rental registration, if there's over-aggressive code enforcement, attempts to force landlords to take subsidized housing, even though there's draconian regulation that comes with that type of thing, those are all alarming things from an investment standpoint, in addition to rising taxes and utility bills and everything else. Because at the end of the day, when you apply all of those forces, something's going to break. The landlord can't pay all of the increases in all the utilities and bear all of the burdens of society that are trying to be put on them, and then also have rent controls in place. The reality is when those utilities go up, landlords usually don't have a huge margin that they're operating with. There's a lot of expenses associated with running a property. So when those utilities go up, the landlord passes that on to the tenant. And I think that that's a piece that a lot of people don't understand. I think a lot of people are voting or supporting these concepts thinking that this is going to benefit the renter, when the reality is it really doesn't benefit the renter, because ultimately the landlord has no choice but to pass those costs on. When we get a tax increase, for example, which is a very regular occurrence these days on real estate, those costs, we basically take that number, we divide it by the number of units, and that's the rent increase that we send out. And we've had to do that several times, and sometimes at very high rates, unbelievable increases over the course of 1 or 2 years. I think that a lot of tenants don't understand that, and a lot of other people. In fact, we try to send letters when that happens to our tenants. We give them a copy of the tax bill, and we show them the math and say, this is why we're doing the increase.
And not only the expenses, but also significant damage when the tenant moves out, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge factor. And I can tell you a little war story. I grew up on Section 8 myself. And so I've always prided myself on offering a fairly large percentage of our portfolio as subsidized housing. And my rule of thumb was that I always tried to offer 25% as subsidized housing. And that, I will tell you, has been eroding rapidly in the last few years. I have found it almost impossible to continue to offer that level of housing for subsidies. A lot of that comes from what you're talking about, the damages. Not only have the rents not necessarily kept up, but it feels as though a lot of the programs have become very aggressive with the inspection things. I know people, for example, who were renting to subsidized housing, and they came in and inspected this guy's building and told him that the foundation had a crack in it, and they basically abated him and made him replace the entire foundation. It cost him $45,000 to fix the issue. All the while, to clarify what abatement means, that means that when they find a problem, they send you this letter telling you have 30 days to fix it, and then they stop paying rent until you fix it. And you can't get any of the back rent back. So once they abate you, it's done. So not only did he all of a sudden get a letter saying you need to fix this thing, we're also just not going to pay you until you do fix it, and you can't ever get any of the money back. That will leave a pretty bad taste in an investor's mouth. If that's your retirement and you own a duplex and you get hit with something like that, or you get hit with a lead abatement order from the state or something like that, if you only have one duplex, you're done. And you see a lot of people just sell the properties at that point if they can. A lot of other people can't. I've had people call me and beg me to buy their properties when there's an abatement order or something like that on the property, because they're just paying the mortgage, they're paying all the utilities, and they don't have any recourse whatsoever. They can't rent it. There's nothing that they can do. And on top of that, you add things like the city of Bangor is doing, for example, where if you have a vacant building right now, they come in and they'll fine you $1,000. And if you don't pay it within a certain amount of time, it goes up to $4,000. And then it just continues to increase. So imagine if you're a duplex owner and you have an abatement order and it's vacant, you're trying to get this thing all clarified. And you also have these penalties adding up. it creates an impossible environment for landlords to operate within. And I've seen a lot of investors, a lot of pretty big landlords that I know are starting to exit these markets, specifically Bangor and Maine generally, especially with a lot of this talk at the state level.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Mark LaVerdiere, attorney and business owner at Apex Business Law.
So I know we have a housing crisis, and I'm just wondering why the city wouldn't be trying to get more people into houses or apartments and working with the landlords versus working against them.
That's a very good question, and I think that at its core is the fundamental problem. There is a belief that penalizing landlords and putting restrictions and regulations in place is the best approach to get compliance. It appears to me that in their mind, they think you need to punish the landlords and whip them into submission so that they just offer this housing to people. But the reality is that's just never going to work, because if you have a mortgage payment and you have all these other expenses, and then you also force people to take in tenants who are not qualified, who are probably not going to pay the rent or who are going to destroy your apartment, then you're not going to have any income coming in, and you're just going to declare bankruptcy, and the towns are going to end up with these vacant buildings sitting all over the place that nobody's taking care of, except for the taxpayer eventually if they take it through a tax-acquired foreclosure. I think that the better solution is to incentivize the landlords. At the end of the day, if you just start to list the risks associated with investing in real estate, you can pretty easily come up with incentives to mitigate those risks. If you want people to take subsidized housing, you need to offer market level rents, and you also need to offer indemnity types of packages so that if I agree I'm going to take somebody in as a tenant who's probably not otherwise qualified, who I would probably screen out as part of my screening process because they have a prior eviction, for example, or they have a judgment on record for damages that they've done or something like that. I, of course, am never going to take that person on as a tenant unless you're going to give me some kind of guarantee that I'm going to be paid. So if the rent's not paid by the tenant, that the guarantor will pay the rent. If the tenant damages my property, that the guarantor will pay for the damages associated with that. The reality is that those programs just aren't out there. I was working with an organization in Bangor that does a lot of this type of stuff, trying to get people into housing who need housing. And I believe I had something like 15 tenants just from this one program. And what started to happen was I would put somebody in the apartment, and then even though these people were okay when I put them in, they would start to have friends or somebody come by and stay in the apartment. And these people would frankly take advantage of my tenant and start to invite more and more people. And then drugs would start and all these other things. And I'm very aggressive about that stuff. I just don't put up with it in my property. So I immediately moved to evict the people, which takes months in this state to do. All the while, the tenant starts to destroy the apartment as a result of that. And even though I put these people in through this program, the program couldn't do anything. They couldn't pay for any of the damages. And I discussed this with them several times and suggested that, look, I'd like to continue to work with you guys, but I need some kind of guarantee about these damages. That happened 3 times in a row with just that one program, because they were trying to place people who were unhoused or living on the street into apartments. And I would take them on trying to be nice. And then I'd just get burned over and over and over. Apartments that I'd spent $20,000 renovating completely destroyed 1 year later. So after it cost me probably between $40,000 and $60,000, I told them, I'm just not going to rent to anybody in your program unless you guys are going to guarantee the damages. And as much as they wanted to do that, they can't. The conditions of the money that they receive from the state or the federal government just don't allow them to do that. There's no options. So when I talked about incentivizing landlords, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if they really want to fix these housing problems, they need to do things like pass more bills like the one that they just passed, allowing for landlords to build more units. And they also need to provide guarantees against damages, and they need to provide guaranteed rents. Those things would be helpful. They could also do it through tax incentives. They could incentivize you to take on subsidized tenants by offering tax breaks. And those are the types of things that will cause landlords to take action and to do something. That's why we would take on risks, because there has to be some incentive to do it. There has to be something to mitigate the unbelievable expenses that now come with managing properties.
Well, you brought it up. LD 1829, the accessory dwelling unit law that passed back in 2025. Do you want to dig into that law, and how does that affect property owners?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an example of a statute that potentially could help, assuming that some of the other statutes that they're trying to put in place are not going to also pass, because at that point, I think you'll be basically stepping on the gas and stepping on the brake at the same time. But LD 1829 amended an earlier statute that had been put in place to try to permit landlords and people to build an additional dwelling unit on their property. What you had was, at the local level, you had a lot of regulations stopping additional units from being built. And I can tell you, we have a lot of properties that just have empty space. There's a lot of properties that just have areas that are completely empty. Nothing's ever been built out in them, and that we can't build anything, even though we wouldn't be expanding the exterior of the building whatsoever. I would estimate we could probably add at least 30 units to our portfolio just by building out empty spaces within buildings. The legislature had passed a statute, I think it was LD 2003, basically to allow you to build an additional dwelling unit. But what ended up happening was a lot of the local municipalities basically put poison pills in to stop that from happening. And they cited the sprinkler requirements under the fire codes, for example, or they put in setback requirements saying that although the legislature had changed the law with respect to the number of dwelling units, these other restrictions still apply. So in this specific case, you can't do that. So 1829 is basically designed to come in and fix some of those problems. As I understand it, they've actually expanded the number of units as of right to 3 units. And if you have public water and sewer, I think you can go to 4 units. In addition to that, they eliminated the sprinkler requirement, and I think they put restrictions on the setback stuff. So that's exactly the type of bill that the state should be focused on passing. Because what that would do, assuming that was the blank canvas, investors would be rushing to build units and add those in. Because if you just zoom out on that, rather than having to go buy real estate from somebody else for a high price per unit, you can now take your real estate that you own already and you can just do renovations in there. You're not paying extra money for the land value, for example, or any of those things. You can just drive more value into the property, increase the rents, and all at the same time add more units, more housing stock, which is exactly what you always hear they want.
This affects all property owners. Everyone can add an accessory dwelling unit, ADU, to their property, is my understanding. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a parcel, you can add these units. So that's going to benefit a lot of people. It's going to add a lot of housing stock to the state, which will come in different varieties. Some will long-term housing, some short-term housing. But at the end of the day, that's the design, as I understand it, is to increase the number of housing units.
But you still want to make sure you go through your town or city, as you normally would for permitting whenever you plan to construct anything on your property.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Mark LaVerdiere, attorney and business owner at Apex Business Law. Well, let's dive into the proposed LD 1806. It's an act to create a residential rental unit registry, which would establish a statewide rental unit registry with severe financial penalties for noncompliance. What are your thoughts on that?
That particular statute is exactly the type of statute that would cause me to never buy another rental property in the state of Maine. What they've designed there, and I hope and pray that it doesn't pass because I think it will be very harmful to the housing market here in Maine. But essentially, they want to put a rental registration in place. This is sponsored, by the way, by the representative out of Bangor. They want this rental registration in place, but the biggest problem, as I see it, is that the penalty associated with failing to register is you can't evict the tenant for 4 months after that, which means you could lose 4 months worth of rent at least. It'll be more than that because it takes 2 months or so to evict a tenant. You could lose 33% to 50% of your gross revenue just for failing to register, just because of an administrative error. I think that that is so scary that I would never consider to buy a rental property after that. And I would probably, frankly, start selling some of my stuff to just relocate to other states and invest in other states. Imagine that in any other business context, that the penalty for failing to register would be 6 months worth of revenue. That's pretty crazy. One other issue with LD 1806 is the concept. They want a rental registry, which means they want a list of every asset that every investor in the state owns. Every person who has a duplex or just 2 duplexes or whatever, they literally want to take their information and put it on this database, which in theory could be searchable. So all of a sudden, anybody and their mother can go on and search all of your assets and see what's going on. That's obviously a privacy consideration. But in addition to that, we've seen across the country when they put a registry in place like that, it's a precursor to rent control. You can't regulate what you don't know about. So what they do is they try to create the list And then once they have the list of every single unit in the entire state, they can start to ask for a report of what your rent is for that unit. And once they know that, then they can control the rent. And this combination is just the death knell for the housing market in Maine, as far as I see it. To put a registry in place that's going to be followed by rent controls, which is what the city of Portland did, for example, that killed a lot of its rental market. And then to couple that with this draconian penalty of taking all of your gross revenue away from you for months, I don't see how that's sustainable.
How much do you think it costs the state to put administration in charge of all of this? It sounds like it's going to be millions of dollars with computers and everything else.
Absolutely. And what they'll do is they will put the registry in place and they'll charge landlords each unit. They'll charge by the unit. For example, the town of Orono charges, I think, either $50 or $100 per unit for their registry over there. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. Those costs just get passed on to the tenant at the end of the day until they start putting rent controls in place. And then when they put the rent controls in place, you see the landlords all exit the market, or you see the buildings start to go downhill because they can't afford to repair them. It's circular logic. The problem is they don't incentivize landlords investing and building units, and they don't make it so that it makes sense for them to do it. People are naturally going to go the path of least resistance. And what they're not doing is, in my view, they're not harnessing human nature. If you look at capitalism just conceptually, the brilliance of it, in my opinion, is that it recognizes that human beings are selfish, inherently selfish to some extent. And so what it does is it puts reins on that. It says, go ahead, the sky's the limit. Work hard and you can make as much as you want. And society benefits from that. And what they're not doing in this situation is they're not recognizing that. If they put the incentives there for investors to go to town on building housing units and offering housing, they would have no shortage of housing units in this state. There's no question about it. People are itching to try to invest and make money. You see that in other states, and you see that in the stock market. A lot of people listening to this may not have real estate, but I guarantee you a lot of them are watching Robinhood or whatever, and they're hearing about this stock that's going to go big or that stock, and they take their dollars and they put it there, and that's how they try to make money. There's no difference with real estate investors. Real estate investors have just decided they like brick and mortar asset that they physically can hold, and they want to get a return from it. That's what drives it. So I think they need to do these incentives, and that will solve the problem by itself. It doesn't take regulation. It just takes the free market. It just takes incentives and let the investors do their work.
Well, another bill that's being discussed is LD 847, which in effect would be rent control because it would be a form of housing discrimination to refuse rent because of a person's source of money. What are your thoughts on that?
That's another example of a statute that's going to drive investors out of the state. I rent to many people on Section 8, and I've done that for years, and it's not easy. At the end of the day, they come in and, like I said earlier, they inspect the property regularly, and it's anybody's guess what they're going to come out with. I mean, sometimes they just randomly tell you need to go replace this deck, or you need to replace the roof, you need to replace the foundation in that one example. Sometimes it's a small thing, sometimes it's a big thing. They don't have any recognition on their end of the realities of repairing things. It's hard to get repair done. It's hard to find handymen. And they give you 30 days, generally speaking, to do it. And then they stop paying the rent. So if you can't get somebody in there to fix it right away, you have a big problem. Now you don't have any rent coming in, and you have this repair you have to do, and it can get into a spiral for you pretty fast. So the state of the law currently is the Maine Supreme Court has said that you can refuse to participate in the administrative burdens associated with renting to Section 8. That's a legitimate reason not to rent to a Section 8 program. And that's because they recognize that there are very serious administrative hurdles that you have to jump in order to participate in the program. They send out paperwork regularly that you need to fill out. They check the income of the individual. They send you updated sheets telling you how much they're going to pay, how much the individual is going to pay. You're kind of just in the passenger seat for a lot of that. So the courts have recognized that you can, as a business person, say, I don't want to go through the administrative nightmare that it is to work with Section 8 sometimes. So this bill is trying to get around that. It's trying to establish the law as being that you just have to take Section 8 no matter what. And that would create quite a business problem for a lot of landlords.
What about being reimbursed? Are you getting paid on the timely manner?
I think it depends on the program. So the sources of the revenue have an impact on that. If you're dealing with a local housing authority, I would say you're generally getting paid, or at least I have been getting paid when I've dealt with Bangor Housing or Old Town Housing or something like that. They pay their bills. But sometimes you get with a private program and they're receiving federal funding. So it's not really a Section 8 situation in that case. Instead, it's you took somebody who was living on the street, you put them in the place, and you have a shelter program or something paying you the rent. Those ones, I have heard of people not getting paid all the time. And so there's some risk there. You can see how those are very volatile organizations that are heavily linked to the federal funding. So obviously when the federal funding was flowing freely, there were no problems. And we saw that a little bit in Lewiston, for example. We owned a portfolio in Lewiston for a little while. We were seeing rents down there in some of the units that were above market. And sometimes the city of Portland was paying that. Sometimes the city of Lewiston was paying that. Sometimes different programs. There seemed to be no end of the number of nonprofits that were popping up and paying rent for people. That went on for a little while, but I think it tightened up a lot when the federal funding slowed down. So it's an ongoing problem. I think it's causing people to go a little bit more cautiously when renting to those programs for nonprofits in particular.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 with Mark LaVerdiere, attorney and business owner at Apex Business Law. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, Sunday, February 8th at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, The Voice of Maine.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.